My husband looked across the candlelit table at our 25th anniversary dinner and announced he was leaving me for a 19-year-old college student who wanted to have his babies. What he didn't know was that I had medical records in my purse proving he'd been sterile for over a decade. And his teenage girlfriend was about to learn why some dreams are just impossible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The reservation at Romano's Italian Bistro had been made 6 months in advance. 25 years of marriage deserved the perfect celebration, and I'd spent weeks planning every detail of our anniversary dinner. The restaurant held so many memories for David and me. Our first date, the night he proposed, countless celebrations over the years. The familiar warmth of the dim lighting and soft jazz music felt like coming home. I sat across from my husband of 25 years, watching him fidget with his wedding ring while studying the wine menu. David looked handsome in his navy blazer, the same one he'd worn to Jake's graduation last spring. At 48, he still had the boyish charm that had captured my heart at that charity fundraiser all those years ago, though silver now streaked his dark hair and laugh lines had deepened around his eyes. The waiter approached with practiced elegance, filling our glasses with the Chianti David had selected. I raised my glass, expecting the toast we'd shared every anniversary since our wedding day. Instead, David seemed distracted, his phone buzzing insistently on the white tablecloth beside his bread plate. To 25 incredible years, I said, hoping to recapture his attention. And to whatever comes next. David's smile felt forced as he clinked his glass against mine. 25 years, he repeated, but his voice lacked the warmth I remembered from previous anniversaries. The phone buzzed again, lighting up with a text message. I caught a glimpse of a name I didn't recognize, Emma, before David quickly flipped the device face down. Work emergency? I asked, though something in my chest tightened with unease. Something like that, he muttered, taking a long sip of wine. I tried to push down the growing anxiety. This was our special night, our celebration of a quarter-century together. We'd weathered so much as a couple. The early years of financial struggle when David was building his career at the marketing firm, the challenges of raising 2 children while both working full-time, the stress of Jake's rebellious teenage years, and the adjustment when both kids left for college. We'd grown stronger through each challenge, or so I'd believed. The server arrived to take our order, and I watched David's face as he mechanically requested his usual grilled salmon with risotto. I ordered the chicken piccata, the same dish I'd chosen on our first date in this very restaurant. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was clinging to traditions while David seemed eager to escape them. Remember when we brought Jake and Lily here for Jake's 18th birthday? I asked, trying to spark the easy conversation that had once flowed between us. Lily was so impressed by the white tablecloths and fancy silverware. She practiced her table manners for a week before we came. David's phone buzzed again. This time he glanced at it openly, his fingers moving quickly across the screen as he typed a response. When he looked up, I realized he hadn't heard a word I'd said. I'm sorry, what were you saying about Lily? The dismissal stung more than I cared to admit. Never mind, I said quietly. It wasn't important. But it was important. These shared memories were the foundation of our marriage, the threads that wove our lives together. When did David stop caring about those threads? When did our conversations become background noise to whatever was happening on his phone? The appetizers arrived. Calamari that we'd shared on countless dates. A tradition that had become as comfortable as an old sweater. I watched David take a distracted bite while scrolling through what appeared to be a series of text messages. His expression shifted from annoyance to something I couldn't quite identify. Anticipation, maybe, or excitement. David, I said firmly, could you please put the phone away? It's our anniversary. He looked up, and for a moment I saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes. You're right. I'm sorry. He placed the phone in his jacket pocket, but I could see the effort it took. Tell me about your day. How was the end-of-semester faculty meeting? I appreciated the attempt, but the question felt rehearsed, like he was reading from a script of how to be a good husband. I told him about the meeting anyway, about the budget cuts affecting the English department, and the new curriculum requirements for next year. He nodded at appropriate intervals, but I could see his attention drifting, his hand unconsciously moving toward his pocket where the phone waited. Our main courses arrived with the ceremony that Romano's was known for, the flourish of ground pepper, the careful arrangement of garnishes, the server's practiced smile. I cut into my chicken and took a bite, tasting nothing but the metallic flavor of anxiety. Something was wrong. After 25 years of marriage, I knew David's moods better than my own, and tonight he was somewhere else entirely. The kids called earlier, I said, making another attempt at connection. They both wanted to wish us a happy anniversary. Jake's excited about his summer internship at the law firm, and Lily finally decided on her major psychology. She wants to help teenagers with anxiety and depression. That's nice, David said, cutting his salmon with mechanical precision. She'll be good at that. The response was flat, generic, the kind of thing you say to a stranger's small talk. I studied his face, looking for signs of the man who used to light up whenever we talked about our children's accomplishments. Jake and Lily had been the center of our world for so long, the topic that could always bring us together, even when work stress or financial pressures created distance between us. Are you feeling all right? I asked. You seem distracted tonight. David's hand stilled on his fork. For a moment, I thought he might actually tell me what was bothering him. Instead, he forced another smile and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired from the Peterson campaign. You know how demanding client deadlines can be. The endearment should have warmed me, but it felt hollow. David had been working late on client projects for months, often not coming home until after 10 o'clock. I'd assumed it was the natural ebb and flow of his marketing career, the price of success at a competitive firm. Now I wondered if there was more to those late nights than PowerPoint presentations and strategy meetings. His phone buzzed again, this time with enough force to vibrate against the table. David's eyes immediately darted to his pocket, and I saw his jaw tighten with the effort of not reaching for it. Whatever was happening on that device was clearly more compelling than our anniversary dinner. Why don't you just answer it? I said, unable to keep the hurt from my voice. Obviously, it's important. It's not important, he said quickly. Nothing's more important than this. Than us. But even as he spoke the words, I could see the lie in his eyes. Something or someone was pulling his attention away from our marriage, away from the life we'd built together. I'd felt it for months. The distance, the distraction, the way conversations died when he entered a room. I'd told myself it was work stress, midlife adjustment, the natural settling that happened in long marriages. Now, sitting across from him in the restaurant where we'd celebrated so many milestones, I had to face the possibility that my husband was becoming a stranger. The server approached with the dessert menu, the same ritual we'd performed every anniversary. Usually, we shared the tiramisu and lingered over coffee, talking about our hopes for the year ahead. Tonight, David glanced at his watch and shifted restlessly in his seat. Maybe we should skip dessert, he said. It's getting late. It was barely 9 o'clock, and we'd never skipped dessert at Romano's. Not once in 25 years. I felt something crack inside my chest, a hairline fracture in the foundation of everything I'd believed about our marriage. Of course, I said, my voice carefully neutral. If you're ready to go. David signaled for the check with obvious relief. As we waited for the server to process his credit card, I studied his face in the soft candlelight. When had the laugh lines around his eyes become worry lines? When had his smile become something he put on like a mask? When had my husband become someone I no longer recognized? The drive home passed in near silence, punctuated only by the soft jazz playing on the radio and the occasional buzz of David's phone. I watched the familiar streets of Cedar Park blur past the window, each landmark a reminder of the life we'd built together. The elementary school where Jake had played his first soccer game. The park where we'd taught Lily to ride her bike. The coffee shop where David and I used to steal away for weekend mornings before the kids were awake. When we pulled into our driveway, the house looked exactly as we'd left it. The porch light glowing warmly, the garden I'd spent all spring planting creating neat borders along the walkway. It was a beautiful home, The kind of place we dreamed of when we were young and struggling to make ends meet. Now it felt like a stage set, a perfect facade hiding something that was slowly rotting underneath. David was already checking his phone before we reached the front door. In the harsh light of the screen, I could see his expression change from the polite attention he'd shown me all evening to something much more engaged. He was texting rapidly, his fingers moving with the urgency of someone who'd been forced to wait too long to communicate. "I think I'll go to bed early," I said as we entered the house. "It's been a long day." He responded absently, still focused on his phone. "I'll be up in a few minutes. I just need to respond to a few emails." But I knew he wouldn't be up in a few minutes. Lately, David had been staying downstairs later and later, always with some excuse about work or client communications. By the time he came to bed, I was usually asleep, and in the morning, he was gone before I woke up. We'd become roommates sharing a house, our lives running parallel but no longer intersecting. As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I could hear David's voice drifting up from the kitchen. He was on the phone, his tone animated in a way it hadn't been all evening. I paused on the landing, straining to hear the conversation, but he was speaking too quietly for me to make out the words. What I could hear was the warmth in his voice, the engagement that had been missing from our anniversary dinner. I got ready for bed in the master bathroom we'd renovated 3 years ago, remembering how excited we'd been about the double vanity and the walk-in shower. We'd planned it as a retreat, a space where we could prepare for each day together and unwind from the stresses of work and parenting. Now I used it alone, while David's voice carried on downstairs, speaking to someone who could hold his attention in ways I apparently no longer could. As I lay in bed waiting for sleep, I listened to the familiar sounds of our house settling around me. The hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of David's voice, the creak of floorboards that had been our soundtrack for 15 years. It was the same house, the same sounds, but somehow everything felt different, like I was living in a place that belonged to someone else, married to a man who was slowly disappearing before my eyes. David's phone call ended just after midnight, and I heard his footsteps on the stairs. He moved quietly, trying not to wake me, but I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering when our marriage had become something we both had to pretend was still working. He slipped into bed beside me, his movements careful and distant. "Good night," he whispered, but he didn't reach for me the way he used to. There was no goodnight kiss, no gentle touch, no whispered appreciation for the evening we'd shared. Just the careful distance of two people sharing a bed but no longer sharing a life. I lay in the darkness long after David's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. The anniversary dinner that was supposed to celebrate our past had instead highlighted. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, how far we'd drifted from each other. Something was happening to my marriage, something I couldn't name but could no longer ignore. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic on the highway. Normal people living normal lives, going to sleep beside partners who still chose them, still wanted to be with them. I pulled the covers closer and tried to remember the last time David had looked at me the way he used to, the way he'd looked at his phone all evening. The digital clock on my nightstand showed 12:47 a.m., officially ending our 25th anniversary. As I finally drifted towards sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just witnessed the beginning of the end of something I'd spent half my life building. In the morning, I told myself, everything would look different. The distance I'd felt was just anniversary nerves, the pressure of celebrating a milestone that forced us both to examine our relationship too closely. But deep down, I knew that morning wouldn't bring the reassurance I was desperately seeking. Something had changed in my marriage, and no amount of wishful thinking would change it back. The foundation I'd spent 25 years building was cracking, and I was about to discover just how deep those cracks ran. 3 weeks after our disastrous anniversary dinner, David suggested we meet for lunch at Olive Garden. The choice struck me as odd since we rarely ate at chain restaurants, preferring the local Austin spots we'd discovered over the years. But I was grateful for any opportunity to reconnect, to bridge the growing chasm that seemed to widen with each passing day. I arrived at the restaurant 5 minutes early, choosing a booth near the window where the afternoon sunlight streamed through the glass. The lunch crowd was typical for a Tuesday afternoon. Business people grabbing quick meals, retirees enjoying leisurely conversations, and a few families with young children. The familiar comfort of the bustling atmosphere made me hopeful that David and I could find our way back to easier conversation. David walked in precisely on time, his movements purposeful but somehow different. He was wearing the blue Oxford shirt I'd bought him for Christmas, paired with khakis that looked freshly pressed. His hair was styled differently too, shorter and more contemporary than the conservative cut he'd worn for years. When had he changed his hairstyle? How had I missed such an obvious transformation? "Sorry I'm a few minutes late," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. Traffic on Mopac was terrible. "You're not late," I replied, studying his face for clues about his mood. "I was just early." The server approached with menus and the usual cheerful greeting, but David barely acknowledged her presence. His attention was focused somewhere beyond my shoulder, scanning the restaurant like he was looking for someone or ensuring we wouldn't be seen by anyone he knew. The paranoid thought struck me as ridiculous at first, but his nervous energy was impossible to ignore. "How was your morning?" I asked, attempting to start the conversation on neutral ground. "Fine. Busy. The Peterson campaign is entering the final phase, and the client wants to see 3 different creative concepts by Friday." His response was automatic, the kind of professional update he might give to a colleague. There was no warmth in his voice, no invitation for further discussion. We ordered our meals, soup and salad for me, chicken parmigiana for him, and fell into the uncomfortable silence that had become our new normal. David's phone sat face up on the table beside his water glass, and I noticed his eyes drift to it every few seconds. The device remained mercifully quiet during our conversation, but I could sense his anticipation, like he was waiting for something important to happen. "Jake called last night," I said, filling the silence with news about our son. "His internship at the law firm is going really well. He's thinking about applying to UT Law School after graduation." "That's good," David replied absently, his attention clearly divided. He also mentioned that he might bring someone home for summer break, a girl he's been seeing seriously. Jessica, I think her name is. This news would normally have prompted questions about Jake's girlfriend, teasing about our son's romantic life, or plans for meeting this important person. Instead, David nodded vaguely and reached for his breadstick. "And Lily's psychology professor wants her to apply for a research position next semester," I continued, testing whether anything about our children's lives would engage him. "She's really excited about the opportunity to work with students who have anxiety disorders." David responded, his eyes once again drifting to his phone. The server brought our meals with the standard Olive Garden flourish, generous portions artfully arranged on oversized plates. I watched David cut into his chicken with mechanical precision, his movements suggesting his mind was entirely elsewhere. The man sitting across from me looked like my husband, wore my husband's clothes, and spoke with my husband's voice, but the essential essence of David seemed to have been replaced by a distracted stranger. "David," I said firmly, setting down my fork, "what's going on?" He looked up with the startled expression of someone caught daydreaming in a meeting. "What do you mean?" "You've been distracted for weeks. You barely spoke during our anniversary dinner. You're working later than ever. And right now you're acting like you'd rather be anywhere else than having lunch with your wife." For a moment, I thought he might actually tell me the truth. His expression shifted, and I saw something that looked like guilt flicker across his features. But instead of honesty, he reached for his familiar deflection. "I told you, the Peterson campaign is demanding. I'm just stressed about the deadline." "It's not just work stress," I pressed. "Something's changed, David. We've been married for 25 years, and I know when something's wrong." His phone buzzed against the table, and I watched his entire demeanor transform. The distracted businessman disappeared, replaced by someone suddenly alert and engaged. He glanced at the screen, and a smile played at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him all afternoon. "I need to take this," he said, already reaching for the device. "David, we're in the middle of a conversation." "It'll just be a minute," he said, standing up from the booth. "It's important." He walked toward the restaurant's entrance, phone pressed to his ear, his voice immediately becoming animated in a way it hadn't been during our entire lunch. I sat alone in the booth, watching my husband through the window as he paced the sidewalk outside, gesturing with his free hand like he was having the most engaging conversation of his day. The irony was devastating. Here I was, trying to address the growing distance in our marriage, and David was literally walking away from me to take a phone call that clearly excited him more than anything I'd said in weeks. I picked up my soup, tasting nothing but the bitter realization that I was competing with someone or something for my own husband's attention, and I was losing. When David returned to the table 10 minutes later, his whole energy had changed. He looked relaxed, almost happy, the tension that had defined his posture for weeks suddenly absent. Whatever conversation he'd just had accomplished what 25 years of marriage apparently couldn't, it had made him smile. "Sorry about that," he said, sliding back into the booth. "Client emergency." But I'd watched him through the window. I'd seen the way he smiled while talking, the way his whole body seemed to come alive. That wasn't the posture of someone dealing with a work crisis. That was the posture of someone talking to someone who mattered to them. "Who was it?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Peterson's marketing director." She had some questions about the campaign timeline. The lie came so easily that I wondered how many others I'd been accepting without question. David had worked with Peterson's marketing director for 6 months, and her name was Linda Caldwell. I'd met her at the company Christmas party, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. The person David had just been talking to had made him smile like a teenager with a crush. "Well," I said, forcing myself to take another spoonful of soup, "I hope you got everything sorted out." "Yeah, all good," he said, attacking his chicken parmigiana with renewed appetite. "Where were we?" But we weren't anywhere anymore. Whatever fragile connection we'd managed to maintain during the first part of lunch had been severed by that phone call. David had shown me with devastating clarity that someone else's voice could engage him in ways mine no longer could. We finished our meal in relative silence, David occasionally making comments about the food or the weather, but the earlier tension had returned. When the server brought the check, David paid quickly, obviously eager to end our time together. As we walked to our cars in the parking lot, I felt the weight of everything unsaid between us. "Thanks for lunch," I said, the words feeling hollow. "Of course," he replied, already reaching for his car keys. "I'll probably be late tonight. The Peterson timeline is really tight." I watched him drive away, his expensive sedan disappearing into the Austin traffic, and felt something inside me break. Not dramatically, not with the shattering pain of sudden loss, but with the quiet crack of something that had been under pressure for too long. My marriage was ending, and my husband was already gone. I just didn't know where he'd gone or who he'd gone there with. That evening, I sat in our kitchen with a cup of tea, staring at my phone and debating whether to call Amanda Wilson, my closest friend, and the one person who might help me make sense of what was happening. Amanda had been through her own divorce 5 years earlier, and she'd often told me that the signs had been there long before she'd been willing to see them. But calling Amanda would make this real. It would mean admitting that my marriage was in trouble, that the man I'd spent half my life loving was pulling away from me in ways I couldn't ignore. Instead, I sat in the quiet house, listening for David's car in the driveway and wondering who he was talking to when he thought I wasn't watching. He came home after 11 that night, moving quietly through the house like he was trying not to wake me. I heard him in the kitchen, opening the refrigerator and moving around with the careful steps of someone who didn't want to be detected. When he finally came upstairs, I pretended to be asleep, listening to him get ready for bed in the master bathroom. As David settled into his side of our king-sized bed, I felt the careful distance he maintained, the way he arranged himself to avoid any accidental contact. We lay there in the darkness, two people who had once shared everything now, sharing nothing but a mattress and a slowly dying history. The next morning brought an email that would change everything, though I didn't recognize its significance at the time. I was grading essays in my classroom during my prep period when my phone chimed with a message from Dr. Rebecca Davis's office. It was a routine reminder about David's upcoming annual physical, scheduled for the following week. The message should have been unremarkable. Just another item in the endless list of appointments and obligations that filled our calendar. But something about it triggered a memory that had been buried under years of busy family life and career responsibilities. David had been having these annual physicals for over a decade, ever since he'd turned 35 and become more conscious about his health. What struck me as odd was that I couldn't remember him ever mentioning anything significant from these appointments. Most couples shared health updates, didn't they? When I had my mammogram or annual gynecological exam, I always told David about the results, discussed any concerns with him, treated our health as a shared responsibility. But David's medical appointments had always been private affairs, handled independently with minimal discussion afterward. I saved the email and continued grading, but the thought nagged at me throughout the afternoon. During my lunch break, I found myself thinking about other medical appointments David had attended over the years. There had been that specialist consultation 3 years ago for what he'd described as a minor issue. He'd gone alone, come home without much explanation, and never mentioned it again. At the time, I'd respected his privacy, assuming that if something serious was wrong, he would tell me. Now I wondered what else David had been handling privately. After school that day, I stopped by the grocery store to pick up ingredients for dinner, hoping that cooking David's favorite meal might create an opportunity for better conversation than we'd managed at lunch earlier in the week. As I wandered the aisles, my phone rang with a call from Jake. "Hey, Mom." My son's voice carried the easy warmth that had been missing from my interactions with David. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing." "I'm fine, sweetheart. How are classes going?" "Good, really good. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something. Jessica and I are getting pretty serious, and I was wondering if it would be okay if I brought her home for a weekend sometime soon. I'd really like you and Dad to meet her." The request filled me with a complicated mixture of joy and anxiety. I was thrilled that Jake had found someone special, but the thought of hosting his girlfriend while David and I were struggling to maintain basic civility felt overwhelming. "Of course," I said, pushing my concerns aside. "We'd love to meet her. When were you thinking?" "Maybe in a couple of weeks. I know it's short notice, but we're both free the weekend after finals, and I thought it might be a good time before everyone gets too busy with summer plans." "That sounds perfect. I'll talk to your father and make sure we don't have any conflicts." "Thanks, Mom. You're the best." "Oh, and Mom? Is everything okay? You sound a little stressed." Jake's perceptive question caught me off guard. If my 22-year-old son could detect strain in my voice during a brief phone call, how obvious was the tension in my marriage? I forced a lighter tone into my response. "Just tired from the end of the school year. You know how crazy things get with final exams and graduation preparations." "Yeah, I remember. Well, don't work too hard, okay? And tell Dad I said hi." After Jake hung up, I stood in the pasta aisle, feeling the weight of my divided loyalties. I wanted to be excited about meeting my son's girlfriend, to plan the perfect weekend that would welcome her into our family. But how could I present a happy, stable home when my own marriage was quietly falling apart? That evening, I prepared David's favorite dinner, grilled steak with roasted vegetables, and the garlic mashed potatoes he'd always claimed were better than his mother's recipe. I set the dining room table with our good china, lit candles, and opened a bottle of the Cabernet we'd been saving for a special occasion. If David and I were going to discuss Jake's visit, I wanted the conversation to happen in an atmosphere that encouraged connection rather than conflict. David arrived home at his usual late hour, looking surprised by the formal dinner setup. "What's the occasion?" he asked, loosening his tie as he surveyed the dining room. "No occasion," I replied, carrying the steaks from the kitchen. "I just thought it would be nice to have a proper dinner together. We haven't done that in a while." "It looks great," he said, though his tone suggested he was more puzzled than pleased by the gesture. We sat across from each other at the polished mahogany table, where we'd shared thousands of meals over the years. The candles cast warm shadows across David's face, softening the new lines of stress I'd been noticing. For a moment, I could almost pretend we were the couple we used to be, before whatever had come between us had taken root. "Jake called today," I said, cutting into my steak. "He wants to bring his girlfriend home for a weekend soon. I told him we'd love to meet her." David's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "His girlfriend? Jessica, he's mentioned her before. They've been dating for several months, and apparently it's getting serious. When is he planning to come?" "The weekend after his finals. In about 2 weeks." David was quiet for a long moment, chewing thoughtfully. When he spoke, his voice carried an edge of anxiety I couldn't quite interpret. 2 weeks might not work for me. The Peterson campaign launches that weekend, and I'll probably need to be available for any client concerns. It's a Saturday and Sunday, David. Surely you can take one weekend off to meet your son's girlfriend. You don't understand how demanding this campaign is, Sarah. Peterson is our biggest client, and if something goes wrong with the launch, it could affect the entire agency. I set down my fork and looked directly at him. Jake is asking us to meet someone who's important to him. This isn't a casual request, David. He's bringing her home because he's serious about her. I know that, David said defensively. I'm not saying I won't be here. I'm just saying I might need to be available if work issues come up. When did work become more important than our family? The question hung in the air between us, heavier than I'd intended. David's expression tightened, and I could see him preparing the familiar defense about providing for our family, about the responsibilities that came with his position at the agency. That's not fair, Sarah. Everything I do is for this family. Is it? I asked quietly. Because lately it feels like everything you do is to avoid this family. David's phone, which had been silent through dinner, suddenly buzzed with an incoming call. I watched his eyes dart to the device, saw the familiar transformation in his posture as he read the caller's name. Without asking for my permission or acknowledging the serious conversation we were having, he reached for the phone. I need to take this, he said, already standing up from the table. David, we're in the middle of discussing Jake's visit. It'll just be a minute, he said. The same words he'd used at the restaurant. This is important. He walked into the kitchen, and I could hear his voice change the moment he answered the call. The defensive tension from our conversation disappeared, replaced by warmth and engagement that he hadn't shown me all evening. I sat alone at the carefully set table, looking at the flickering candles and the meal I'd prepared with such hope, feeling like a fool for thinking dinner and wine could compete with whoever was commanding David's attention. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. I could hear David's laughter drifting from the kitchen, the animated tone that used to be reserved for conversations with me. When he finally returned to the dining room, his food was cold and my patience was exhausted. Sorry about that, he said, sitting back down as if nothing had happened. Work crisis. Of course it was, I replied, my voice flat with resignation. What's that supposed to mean? It means that every phone call is a work crisis. Every evening you're late is because of client demands, and every conversation we try to have gets interrupted by something more important than our marriage. David's face flushed, and I could see anger building behind his eyes. That's completely unfair. I work hard to provide for this family, and if that means I have to be available when clients need me, then that's what I do. Who was on the phone, David? The question caught him off guard, and for a split second, I saw panic flicker across his expression. What do you mean? I mean exactly what I asked. Who was on the phone that was so important it couldn't wait until after dinner? Linda Caldwell, Peterson's marketing director. She had concerns about the launch timeline. Another lie, delivered with the same practiced ease I was beginning to recognize. I'd heard David's voice during that phone call, had listened to the laughter and warmth that suggested something far more personal than a business discussion with a middle-aged marketing director. I see, I said quietly. We finished dinner in silence, the romantic atmosphere I'd tried to create poisoned by the growing suspicion that my husband was living a double life. As I cleared the dishes, I found myself studying David's profile, searching for signs of the man I'd married. When had he become someone who could lie to my face with such casual confidence? When had I become someone who accepted those lies rather than demanding the truth? That night, as David worked on his laptop in the living room, I went to our bedroom early and pulled out the phone number Amanda had given me months ago. She'd insisted I take the contact information for her divorce attorney, just in case I ever needed it. At the time, I'd been almost offended by the suggestion that my marriage might be in trouble. Now I stared at the lawyer's business card, wondering if I was overreacting to what might be nothing more than work stress and poor communication. But David's behavior wasn't just distracted, it was secretive. The phone calls, the lies about who he was talking to, the way he seemed to come alive when speaking to someone who wasn't me. I slipped the business card into my wallet, not ready to make the call but no longer able to pretend that everything was fine. Whatever was happening in my marriage, I needed to be prepared for the possibility that it might not be something we could fix together. The atmosphere in our house over the next few days felt like the tense calm before a summer storm. David and I moved through our routines with careful politeness, but underneath the surface civility, something fundamental had shifted. I found myself watching him in ways I never had before, noticing details that had previously been invisible or unimportant. The way he showered and shaved with extra care on mornings when he claimed to have important client meetings. The frequency with which his phone received text messages, and his growing habit of taking the device with him everywhere, even to the bathroom. The new cologne he'd started wearing, something expensive and modern that replaced the familiar scent I'd bought him for the past 5 Christmases. Most telling of all were the changes in his schedule. David had always been a creature of habit, following predictable patterns that allowed me to coordinate our family life around his work commitments. Lately, those patterns had become erratic. Late nights at the office with no advance warning. Weekend work sessions that required him to leave the house for hours at a time. Business dinners that lasted well past normal business hours. When I tried to pin down specifics, which client required Saturday attention, which colleague needed evening meetings, David's answers became vague and defensive. The Peterson campaign had become his explanation for everything, a catch-all excuse that justified any deviation from normal behavior. On Thursday evening, 3 days after our disastrous dinner conversation, I was grading papers in the living room when David emerged from his home office with his car keys. "I need to run out for a while," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Peterson wants me to review some materials with the creative team." "At 8:30 at night?" I asked, looking up from the essays I was correcting. "The team is working late to meet the deadline. I won't be gone long." "Which team members?" I asked, testing whether his story had any specific details. "Just the usual group. Mark from graphics, Linda from marketing, a few others." Mark Henderson was David's closest colleague at the agency, someone I'd known for years through company social events. Linda Caldwell was the marketing director whose name David had been using to explain mysterious phone calls. The vague few others suggested he was making up details as he spoke. "Will you be back by 10?" I asked. I wanted to discuss the menu for Jake's visit. "Probably closer to 11, David said, already moving toward the garage door. "Don't wait up." After he left, I sat in the quiet house, feeling like a detective gathering evidence for a case I didn't want to solve. David's behavior had moved beyond simple work stress into territory that suggested deliberate deception. The man who had once shared every detail of his day with me was now offering explanations that wouldn't hold up to basic scrutiny. I tried to return to my grading, but concentration proved impossible. Instead, I found myself walking through our house, looking at the life we'd built together with new eyes. Family photos lined the hallway, images of vacations, holidays, milestones that documented 25 years of shared history. In the earlier pictures, David and I stood close together, his arm around my waist, both of us looking genuinely happy to be in each other's company. The more recent photos told a different story. Even at Jake's college graduation just 6 months ago, there was visible distance between David and me. We stood next to each other for the camera, but our body language suggested two people fulfilling an obligation, rather than celebrating together. Had I been blind to the changes happening in our marriage, or had they been so gradual that I'd adjusted to each small shift without recognizing the larger pattern? Looking back, I could identify moments when David had seemed distracted or distant, but I'd attributed each incident to temporary stress, rather than seeing them as symptoms of a deeper problem. My phone rang just before 10 o'clock, interrupting my increasingly dark thoughts. The caller ID showed Amanda's name, and I answered with genuine relief at the prospect of talking to someone who might help me make sense of what I was experiencing. "Hey, Sarah," Amanda's voice carried the warm concern of a friend who knew me well enough to detect trouble. "I was just thinking about you. How are things going?" The simple question opened floodgates I'd been trying to keep closed. Before I could stop myself, I was telling Amanda about the anniversary dinner, the mysterious phone calls, David's increasing absence from our family life, and my growing suspicion that my marriage was in serious trouble. Amanda listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of sympathy or understanding. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Sarah, honey, I hate to say this, but everything you're describing sounds familiar. The secrecy, the phone calls, the way he lights up when he's talking to someone else. Those were exactly the signs I ignored when Mark was having his affair." Hearing the word affair spoken aloud made my stomach drop. I'd been dancing around the possibility in my own mind, but having someone else name it made it suddenly, terrifyingly real. "You think David's cheating on me?" "I think David's behaving like someone who's cheating on you," Amanda said gently. "The question is what you want to do about it." "I don't know," I admitted. "I keep thinking maybe I'm overreacting, maybe it really is just work stress and I'm imagining problems that don't exist." "Sarah, you've been married for 25 years. You know your husband better than anyone. If your instincts are telling you something's wrong, then something's probably wrong. But what if I'm wrong? What if I confront him and he's telling the truth about everything being work-related? I could destroy our marriage over nothing more than my own paranoia." "And what if you're right?" Amanda countered. "What if you ignore your instincts and let this continue? How long are you willing to live with someone who's emotionally checked out of your marriage?" The question hung in the air long after Amanda and I hung up. I sat in the living room until nearly midnight, waiting for David to return from his mysterious meeting. When he finally came home, he moved through the house quietly, clearly expecting me to be asleep. I listened to his careful footsteps on the stairs, the soft sounds of him getting ready for bed, the gentle closing of the bathroom door. When David slipped into bed beside me, I pretended to be asleep while studying his behavior. He seemed relaxed, almost content, in a way that suggested his evening had been enjoyable rather than work-related. There was no stress in his movements, no sign of the pressure that should accompany deadline-driven late-night meetings. The next morning brought another small revelation that added to my growing catalog of inconsistencies. I was making coffee when David's phone, which he'd left charging on the kitchen counter, chimed with a text message. The screen lit up long enough for me to see the sender's name, Emma, and the beginning of a message that read, "Last night was amazing. I can't wait to." The screen went dark before I could read more, but those few words hit me like a physical blow. Last night was amazing. David had spent the evening at what he claimed was a work meeting, but someone named Emma was texting him about having an amazing time. Unless Peterson's marketing team had developed very unconventional meeting strategies, my husband had lied to me about where he'd been and what he'd been doing. I stared at the phone, my hands shaking as I poured coffee into my mug. The evidence was right there, undeniable proof that David was involved with someone else. But even as the truth stared me in the face, part of me wanted to find an innocent explanation. Maybe Emma was a new colleague I didn't know about. Maybe the message was about a successful presentation, or a client dinner that had gone well. But I knew better. The tone of the message, combined with David's recent behavior, painted a picture I could no longer ignore. My husband was having an affair with someone named Emma, and he'd been lying to me about it for weeks, possibly months. David appeared in the kitchen a few minutes later, freshly showered and dressed for work. He moved with the confident energy of someone who'd slept well and was looking forward to his day. When he reached for his phone, I watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of concern about the message he'd received. "Morning," he said cheerfully, checking his messages without any apparent worry about what I might have seen. "Morning," I replied, my voice carefully neutral. "How was your meeting last night?" "Fine. Productive. We got through most of the materials we needed to review." Another lie, delivered with the same casual confidence that was becoming David's trademark. I watched him scroll through his messages, responding to several with the quick efficiency of someone managing multiple conversations. "Any big developments with the Peterson campaign?" I asked, testing whether his story would remain consistent. "Nothing major. Just the usual last-minute adjustments and client concerns. You know how these launches go." But I didn't know how these launches went, because David had never shared details about his work with me. The Peterson campaign had become a convenient fiction, a way to explain absences and phone calls that had nothing to do with advertising deadlines. "Will you be late again tonight?" I asked. David's fingers paused over his phone screen. "Probably. We're getting close to the deadline, so everyone's putting in extra hours. What time should I expect you? Hard to say. Maybe 10 or 11. Don't hold dinner for me. As David gathered his briefcase and headed for the garage, I remained in the kitchen, staring at the spot where his phone had been. The evidence of his affair was mounting, each lie building on the last, creating a structure of deception that was becoming impossible to ignore. I called in sick to work that morning, something I rarely did, but I needed time to think without the distraction of lesson plans and student conferences. After David left, I sat in our bedroom looking through his dresser drawers and closet, searching for additional evidence of the life he was apparently living without me. What I found confirmed my worst fears. New clothes I'd never seen him wear, including shirts in styles younger than his usual conservative choices. A receipt from an expensive jewelry store tucked into a jacket pocket for a purchase I'd never received. Business cards from restaurants I'd never been to, some with phone numbers written on the back in handwriting I didn't recognize. Most damning of all was a credit card statement I discovered in David's briefcase, for an account I didn't know existed. The charges painted a clear picture of a relationship I wasn't part of. Dinners for two at romantic restaurants, purchases from Victoria's Secret, hotel room charges on nights when David had claimed to be working late. As I sat on our bed, surrounded by evidence of my husband's betrayal, I felt something inside me shift from hurt to anger. David hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been systematically lying to me, creating an elaborate fiction to cover his tracks, while building a new life with someone else. The woman I'd been, the trusting wife who accepted explanations and respected privacy, was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who wouldn't be taken advantage of anymore. If David wanted to play games with the truth, then he was about to discover that two people could play that game. I reached for my phone and dialed the number on the business card Amanda had given me. It was time to protect myself, because it was becoming clear that David wasn't going to do it for me. Looking back, I realized the signs had been there for months before I was willing to see them. What I had initially dismissed as work stress or midlife adjustment had actually been the beginning of David's transformation into someone I barely recognized. The revelation about Emma and the hidden credit card forced me to examine our recent history with painful clarity, and the pattern that emerged was both obvious and devastating. The changes had started in January, just after the new year. David had returned from the Christmas break with what I'd assumed was renewed professional energy. He'd mentioned wanting to update his wardrobe, to present a more contemporary image at the agency. I'd even encouraged him, thinking it was healthy for a man approaching 50 to want to refresh his appearance. Now I understood that the new clothes hadn't been about professional confidence. They'd been about impressing someone new. The fitted jeans that replaced his comfortable khakis, the trendy button-down shirts that made him look younger, the expensive sneakers that seemed oddly casual for someone who'd worn dress shoes to work for 20 years. I'd attributed each change to a belated midlife awakening, never considering that David might be dressing for an audience that didn't include me. The gym membership should have been another red flag. In February, David had announced his intention to get back in shape, joining the premium fitness center downtown despite having a perfectly adequate home gym in our basement. He'd claimed the change was about motivation, about needing the energy of other people working out around him. "I think I'll get better results with professional trainers and modern equipment," he'd said, showing me the glossy brochure from Pinnacle Fitness. "Plus, it'll be good to get out of the house for my workouts instead of just going downstairs." I'd supported the decision, even though the monthly fees were significantly higher than what we'd been spending on maintaining our home equipment. When David started coming home, energized from his evening workouts, talking about new exercise routines and training techniques, I'd been pleased that he'd found something that made him happy. Now I wondered if Emma was one of those professional trainers, or perhaps a fellow member who'd caught my husband's attention. The timeline certainly fit. David's mysterious phone calls and distracted behavior had started shortly after he'd joined Pinnacle Fitness. The most painful realization was how David's relationship with our children had changed during the same period. Jake and Lily had both commented, during separate phone calls, about their father seeming distant during their conversations. I'd made excuses for him, explaining that work pressure was making him stressed and distracted. "Dad barely asked about my classes when I called last weekend," Lily had mentioned during one of our regular check-ins. He seemed like he was in a hurry to get off the phone. "Mom, is Dad okay?" Jake had asked after a particularly brief conversation with his father. He didn't seem interested in hearing about my internship interviews. That's not like him. I'd reassured both children that their father was fine, just busy with the demanding project at work. But David's disengagement from our family conversations reflected the same pattern I was seeing in our marriage. His emotional investment was being directed elsewhere. The business trips had increased dramatically as well. David had always traveled occasionally for client meetings, but starting in March, he'd begun taking more frequent trips to cities where the agency had potential new business. Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, all close enough for day trips, but David had started staying overnight, claiming it was more efficient than driving back and forth. "The meetings run late, and it's easier to get a hotel room than to drive home in Austin traffic," he'd explained when I'd questioned the sudden change in his travel patterns. But David had been making day trips to Dallas for years without complaint. Why had overnight stays suddenly become necessary? And why did he always seem relaxed and happy when he returned from these trips, rather than tired from intensive business meetings? I had started keeping a mental catalog of David's absences, and the pattern was disturbing. 3 overnight trips in April, 2 in May, and he'd already mentioned plans for more frequent travel through the summer. Each trip coincided with periods when his phone activity increased, and his attention at home became even more fragmented. The credit card bills had been another source of confusion that I'd chosen to ignore rather than confront. Our family finances had always been transparent. We maintained joint accounts for household expenses and individual accounts for personal spending, with regular discussions about major purchases or financial decisions. But David had started mentioning charges I didn't recognize, explaining them as client entertainment expenses that would be reimbursed by the agency. "I had to take the Peterson team to dinner at that new steakhouse downtown," he'd said when I'd questioned a $300 restaurant charge. "The agency will cover it, but it takes a few weeks to process the reimbursement." "I bought coffee for the entire creative team during our weekend session," he'd explained about multiple charges at expensive coffee shops. "It's easier to put it on my card and get reimbursed later than to try to coordinate payment from everyone." Each explanation had seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they painted a picture of someone spending significant money on activities that didn't include his family. When I'd suggested joining him for one of these client dinners, David had quickly explained that spouses weren't included in business entertainment. "It would be awkward to have family members at a working dinner," he'd said. "The conversation needs to stay focused on the campaign, and having you there would change the dynamic." But I'd attended dozens of David's work events over the years. Holiday parties, client appreciation dinners, agency celebrations. I'd always been welcomed as part of the team. When had that changed, and why? The phone calls had been the most obvious sign, though I'd been slow to recognize their significance. David had always been comfortable taking work calls at home, often putting clients on speaker so I could participate in conversations about scheduling or logistics. His phone had been a shared part of our household, something he'd answer in front of me without hesitation. That openness had disappeared gradually. First, David had started stepping out of the room for certain calls, explaining that they involved sensitive client information that required privacy. Then he'd begun taking his phone with him everywhere in the house, even to the bathroom or out to check the mail. Most recently, he'd started keeping the device face down during meals, claiming the constant notifications were distracting. "I'm trying to be more present during family time," he'd said when I'd commented on the change. "Having the phone face up just encourages me to check messages when I should be focusing on us." But David's version of being present had involved physical presence without emotional engagement. He'd sit at the dinner table with his phone turned over, but his attention would still drift. His responses to conversation would be automatic and generic. The phone might have been hidden, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. The most subtle change had been in David's language patterns. After 25 years of marriage, I knew his speaking habits intimately. The phrases he used, the way he structured sentences, even his casual profanity. But over the past few months, David had started using expressions that were unfamiliar, words and phrases that seemed to come from someone else's vocabulary. "That's so random," he'd said about a news story that surprised him, using slang that sounded forced and unnatural coming from a 48-year-old marketing executive. "I'm totally exhausted," he'd announced after one of his late gym sessions, employing an emphatic style that was unlike his usual measured speech. "This campaign is literally killing me," he'd complained about the Peterson project, using literally in the hyperbolic way that was more characteristic of someone much younger. At the time, I dismissed these changes as David picking up current expressions from his younger colleagues at the agency. Now I wondered if he was unconsciously mimicking the speech patterns of someone who'd become important to him, someone whose approval he was trying to earn. The most painful realization was how long I'd been making excuses for David's behavior, choosing to trust his explanations rather than acknowledging what my instincts were telling me. I'd wanted to believe that our marriage was strong enough to weather whatever challenges were affecting him, that the distance between us was temporary and would resolve itself once work pressures decreased. But work pressures had become David's permanent excuse for everything: missed dinners, forgotten conversations, emotional unavailability, financial irregularities. The Peterson campaign had transformed from a specific project with defined timelines into an all-purpose justification for any behavior that didn't align with his previous patterns. I'd enabled this by accepting each explanation without demanding specifics, by choosing harmony over honesty, by prioritizing the appearance of a stable marriage over the reality of what was actually happening between us. My desire to trust David had made me complicit in my own deception. The evening after I'd discovered the hidden credit card and seen Emma's text message, I sat in our bedroom going through David's remaining belongings with methodical precision. If my husband was living a double life, I needed to understand the full scope of what he'd been hiding from me. His closet revealed more evidence of the transformation I'd been too blind to see. The conservative suits and ties that had defined his professional wardrobe for years had been supplemented with casual clothes that seemed designed for someone trying to appear younger. Designer jeans in a style that would appeal to someone half his age. Polo shirts in bright colors that replaced the navy and white standards he'd worn for decades. Even his underwear had changed from practical cotton briefs to more expensive form-fitting styles. In his dresser drawer, tucked beneath a stack of workout clothes, I found a small velvet jewelry box containing cufflinks I'd never seen him wear. They were modern, expensive-looking pieces that didn't match any of the shirts or suits in his wardrobe. The receipt inside the box showed they'd been purchased 3 weeks earlier at a jewelry store in downtown Austin, charged to the credit card account I'd just discovered. Who bought themselves cufflinks? In 25 years of marriage, David had never shown interest in jewelry beyond his wedding ring and a simple watch. These cufflinks seemed like something someone would buy to impress someone else, accessories chosen to project sophistication and attention to detail. I photographed the receipt and returned the box to its hiding place, adding this evidence to the growing collection of David's deceptions. Each discovery built on the last, creating an undeniable pattern of a man who was investing significant time, money, and emotional energy in a relationship that didn't include his wife. The computer in David's home office provided additional confirmation of what I already suspected. While I didn't have the password to access his personal files, the browser history told its own story. Restaurant websites for places we'd never been together. Hotel booking sites for the cities where David had been taking his mysterious business trips. Even a florist's website, visited multiple times over the past month. Most telling were the searches related to Austin Community College, the local institution where someone named Emma might be a student. David had looked up course schedules, campus maps, and student activities, information that had no connection to his work at the marketing agency, but suggested he was learning about someone else's world. I printed copies of the browser history and added them to the folder I was building, documentation of David's secret life that was becoming impossible to deny. The man I'd been married to for 25 years had been systematically deceiving me, using our shared resources to fund a relationship he was hiding from me. That night, I lay in bed listening to David's breathing and wondering how long the affair had been going on. The evidence suggested it had started gradually, with small changes in behavior that had escalated over time. But when had the friendship or professional relationship become something more? When had David decided that whatever he was getting from Emma was worth risking our marriage? More importantly, when had he stopped caring about the pain his choices would cause me? The David I'd married had been thoughtful and considerate, someone who weighed the consequences of his actions on the people he loved. The man sleeping beside me had become someone who could lie repeatedly, spend money deceptively, and maintain an elaborate fiction without apparent guilt or remorse. The next morning brought another small revelation that added context to David's recent behavior. I was emptying his jacket pockets before taking his suits to the dry cleaner when I found a ticket stub from a movie theater. The film was one I'd expressed interest in seeing, a romantic comedy that had received good reviews. But David had apparently seen it without me, 2 weeks earlier on a Saturday afternoon when he'd claimed to be working at the office. The ticket stub showed a 2 p.m. showing, hardly the time for a business meeting or solo movie experience. Someone had gone to that movie with David, someone who'd shared popcorn and probably held his hand in the darkened theater while I'd been at home grading papers and planning the menu for a family dinner he'd missed because of work obligations. I held the ticket stub for a long time, imagining David and Emma sitting together in the theater, sharing the kind of casual intimacy that couples take for granted. When had David last suggested we go to a movie together? When had he last shown interest in doing anything with me that didn't involve household logistics or family obligations? The realization that my husband was dating someone else while living with me felt like a betrayal beyond simple infidelity. He wasn't just having an affair, he was building a complete relationship with another person, sharing experiences and creating memories that should have been ours. I added the ticket stub to my growing collection of evidence and made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. If David wanted to live a double life, then I needed to understand exactly what that life included. I couldn't compete with someone I didn't know, couldn't address problems I couldn't define. It was time to stop being a passive participant in my own deception and start gathering information that would help me make informed decisions about my future. David had chosen to lie to me, but I didn't have to remain ignorant of the truth he was hiding. I called Tom Rodriguez, the private investigator Amanda had recommended during her own divorce proceedings. Tom had helped Amanda document her ex-husband's affair, providing the evidence she'd needed to protect herself financially during their divorce settlement. Mrs. Martinez. Tom's voice was professional but warm when I explained why I was calling. I'm sorry you're going through this, but I want you to know that you're taking a smart step by seeking information. Knowledge is power in situations like this. I need to know what my husband is doing, I said simply. I need to understand who he's involved with and how serious the relationship is. I understand. Can you give me some basic information about his routine, his work schedule, the times when his behavior seems most suspicious? I spent 30 minutes providing Tom with details about David's recent patterns, the late nights, the weekend trips, the mysterious phone calls, the changes in his appearance and spending habits. Tom listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions that helped me see connections I'd missed. Based on what you're telling me, Tom said when I'd finished, this sounds like a well-established affair rather than a casual indiscretion. The changes in spending, the overnight trips, the investment in appearance, those suggest someone who's building a serious relationship. How long do these investigations usually take? Every case is different, but given the level of suspicious activity you're describing, I should be able to gather significant information within a week or two. The key is documenting patterns and gathering evidence that would hold up in legal proceedings if necessary. Legal proceedings? I'm not saying you'll need them, Tom clarified quickly. But if this situation leads to divorce, having documentation of infidelity and financial deception can be important for protecting your interests. After I hung up with Tom, I sat in my quiet house feeling like I'd crossed a line from which there was no return. Hiring a private investigator meant admitting that my marriage was in serious trouble, that the problems between David and me weren't something we could resolve through better communication or marriage counseling. But I'd tried better communication. I'd attempted to create opportunities for connection. I'd expressed my concerns and been met with lies and deflection. David had made his choice to deceive me. Now I was making my choice to uncover the truth he was hiding. The rest of the week passed in a strange state of suspended animation. David continued his routine of work, late nights, and mysterious phone calls, apparently unaware that I was documenting his behavior and building a case against him. I went to school, taught my classes, and graded papers, maintaining the facade of normal life while conducting my own investigation. Tom's first report arrived via email on Friday afternoon, and the photographs he'd included removed any remaining doubt about David's affair. The images showed my husband entering Pinnacle Fitness with a young blonde woman who looked barely old enough to vote. They were holding hands, laughing at something she'd said, looking like a couple in the early stages of infatuation. Additional photos showed David and the same woman having lunch at a cafe near the gym, sharing food across a small table in the intimate way of people who were completely comfortable with each other. In one image, David was feeding her a bite of dessert, his face showing more joy and engagement than I'd seen from him in months. The woman was beautiful in the way that only very young people can be. Smooth skin, bright eyes, the kind of effortless confidence that comes from never having experienced real disappointment or loss. She was everything I wasn't at 42. Young, unencumbered by children or career responsibilities, free to focus all her attention on the older man who was clearly enchanted by her youth and enthusiasm. Tom's report included basic information he'd gathered about Emma Thompson, 19 years old, a sophomore at Austin Community College studying exercise science, employed part-time as a personal trainer at Pinnacle Fitness. She lived in a small apartment near campus, drove a car that was probably older than she was, and according to social media posts that Tom had accessed, came from a working-class family in East Austin. The age difference was staggering. David was 29 years older than Emma, old enough to be her father. When Emma was born, David and I had already been married for 4 years. When she was learning to walk, I was pregnant with Jake. When she was starting kindergarten, we were buying our first house in Cedar Park. What could a 19-year-old college student possibly have in common with a 48-year-old marketing executive? What could they talk about besides her classes and his midlife crisis? How could David risk everything we'd built together for someone who hadn't even been alive for half our marriage? But as I stared at the photographs of David's obvious happiness with Emma, I had to acknowledge that whatever they shared was real enough to transform my distracted, distant husband into someone who looked genuinely joyful. The man in those pictures was someone I barely recognized, relaxed, animated, completely present in the moment. When had David last looked at me that way? When had he last fed me bites of dessert or held my hand while walking down the street? When had he last given me the kind of focused attention he was clearly giving Emma? The painful truth was that David's affair wasn't just about sex or midlife rebellion. It was about connection, engagement, and the kind of romantic attention that had been missing from our marriage for longer than I cared to admit. Emma wasn't just younger and prettier than me. She was also someone who made David feel like the most interesting person in the world. I couldn't compete with that, and I wasn't sure I wanted to try. The David who could deceive me for months while building a relationship with someone else wasn't the man I'd married, and I wasn't sure he was someone I wanted to fight for. That evening, David came home from work with flowers, a bouquet of mixed roses that he presented with the kind of flourish I hadn't seen from him in years. "What's the occasion?" I asked, accepting the flowers with genuine surprise. "No occasion," he said, kissing my cheek with what seemed like real affection. "I just thought you might like them." But I knew the occasion now. David was probably feeling guilty about his lunch date with Emma, trying to assuage his conscience by making a romantic gesture toward his wife. The flowers weren't a sign of renewed love. They were evidence of his guilt over the relationship he was hiding from me. "They're beautiful," I said, arranging them in a vase while wondering if he'd bought similar flowers for Emma recently. "Thank you. I was thinking we could go out to dinner this weekend," David continued, his voice carrying enthusiasm that felt forced. "Just the two of us. Maybe try that new Italian place downtown." "That sounds nice," I replied, though I wondered if the sudden interest in romance was motivated by guilt or by the need to maintain his cover story. Perhaps Emma was busy this weekend, leaving David free to play the attentive husband. As I watched David help himself to a beer and settle into his favorite chair to read the newspaper, I marveled at his ability to compartmentalize. How could he spend his lunch hour holding hands with a 19-year-old and then come home to present flowers to his wife as if nothing had happened? How could he maintain two completely separate emotional lives without seeming torn apart by the contradiction? The flowers sat on our kitchen table through the weekend, a beautiful reminder of David's deception. Every time I looked at them, I remembered the photographs of him with Emma, the evidence that my husband had become someone capable of elaborate lies and casual cruelty. By Sunday evening, the roses were beginning to wilt, their petals dropping onto the polished wood surface where we'd shared thousands of meals as a family. I threw them away before David came home from his afternoon golf game. Another fiction that I now understood was probably time spent with Emma. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Like the flowers, my marriage was dying, and no amount of careful tending could restore what had already been lost. David's gift had been beautiful for a few days, but it couldn't disguise the rot underneath. As I prepared for another week of pretending everything was normal while gathering evidence of my husband's betrayal, I felt something inside me harden into resolve. David had made his choice when he decided to pursue a relationship with Emma. Now it was time for me to make mine. Tom's second report arrived on a Tuesday morning while David was in the shower, and the contents shattered any remaining illusions I'd been clinging to about the nature of my husband's relationship with Emma Thompson. The private investigator had been thorough, documenting not just casual meetings, but a pattern of behavior that suggested David and Emma were living as a couple whenever they were together. The photographs showed them grocery shopping at the Whole Foods near Emma's apartment, David pushing the cart while she selected produce with the comfortable familiarity of people who cooked together regularly. Another series captured them leaving a mattress store, David's arm around Emma's shoulders as they walked to his car, both looking pleased with whatever purchase they'd just made. Most devastating were the images from the previous Saturday afternoon, when David had told me he was playing golf with his college buddy Marcus. Instead, Tom had documented David and Emma apartment hunting in a complex near the university. The photos showed them touring units, Emma pointing excitedly at features, while David nodded approvingly, both of them clearly planning a shared future that didn't include me. The investigator had also managed to capture audio from their conversation outside one of the apartments, using sophisticated equipment that picked up Emma's voice as she discussed timing and logistics. "I can't wait to get out of that tiny studio," Emma was saying, her voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone young enough to view moving in with an older man as an adventure rather than a compromise. "When do you think you'll be ready to make the transition?" David's response was muffled, but Tom had enhanced the audio enough to make out the key phrases, "soon," "working on it," and most chillingly, "she won't make it difficult. She won't make it difficult." David was discussing the end of our marriage like a business transaction, assuming I would cooperate with his plans to dismantle our life together. The casual confidence in his voice suggested he'd given considerable thought to how he would handle the logistics of leaving me for Emma. I sat in my empty kitchen, still wearing my bathrobe at 10 in the morning, staring at photographs that documented the systematic destruction of my marriage. David wasn't having a midlife crisis or a casual affair. He was methodically building a new life with someone else, while maintaining the fiction of our marriage for his own convenience. The financial records Tom had obtained painted an even clearer picture of David's long-term planning. The hidden credit card I'd discovered was just one of several accounts he'd opened without my knowledge. Over the past 6 months, David had moved significant amounts of money from our joint savings into individual accounts, ostensibly for investment purposes, but actually to shield assets from any potential divorce settlement. He'd also increased his life insurance coverage and changed the beneficiary from me to estate, a technical designation that would give him more control over the distribution of benefits. The paperwork was dated 3 months earlier, around the time his behavior had become most noticeably distant. Most revealing was a series of bank transfers that showed David had been financially supporting Emma for months. Regular deposits into her checking account, payments for her car insurance and student loans, even what appeared to be tuition assistance for her classes at Austin Community College. My husband had been using our marital assets to fund his girlfriend's education and lifestyle, while telling me we needed to be more careful about our household budget. The scope of David's deception was breathtaking. This wasn't a spontaneous affair that had gotten out of hand. It was a calculated plan to transition from one life to another with minimal disruption to his comfort or financial security. He'd been preparing for months to leave me, while I'd been trying to figure out why he seemed distant during dinner conversations. Tom's report included social media analysis that provided additional context for the relationship's timeline. Emma's Instagram posts, which she'd made public despite the obviously compromising nature of her situation, showed a clear progression from professional trainer-client interactions to intimate romantic involvement. The earliest photos, from January, showed Emma with various clients at Pinnacle Fitness, including a few group shots that included David in the background. By February, she was posting pictures of expensive dinners at restaurants I recognized from David's mysterious business meetings. March brought photos of weekend trips to San Antonio and Dallas, locations that matched David's supposed business travel. Most recently, Emma had been posting pictures of jewelry, flowers, and shopping trips that clearly showed someone was spending significant money on her happiness. The captions were carefully worded to avoid specifically naming her benefactor, but the timing and locations matched perfectly with David's absences from home. One post particularly caught my attention: a photo of Emma wearing diamond earrings that looked suspiciously similar to a pair I'd admired at a jewelry store during a rare shopping trip with David 6 weeks earlier. At the time, he'd dismissed them as too expensive, suggesting we wait for a special occasion. Apparently, that special occasion had arrived, just not for me. The age difference between David and Emma became even more stark when viewed through the lens of her social media presence. Her posts reflected the concerns and interests of someone barely out of adolescence. Complaints about professors, excitement about spring break plans, photos with friends who looked like they were playing dress-up in adult clothes. How could David find intellectual stimulation in conversations about college drama and part-time job schedules? What did they discuss during their romantic dinners, her upcoming finals, and his mortgage payments? The disconnect was so vast that I could only conclude the relationship was based primarily on physical attraction and the ego boost David derived from being desired by someone so young. But the evidence suggested their connection went beyond simple physical attraction. The apartment hunting photos showed Emma deferring to David's opinions about practical matters, like neighborhood safety and lease terms. She was clearly viewing him as a provider and protector, someone who could offer stability and financial security in exchange for youth and adoration. For David, Emma represented something I could never provide again: the feeling of being chosen by someone with limitless options. At 19, Emma could date anyone she wanted. The fact that she'd chosen a married man nearly 30 years her senior had to be incredibly flattering to David's ego, especially if he was struggling with fears about aging and relevance. The realization that my marriage was competing with David's need to feel young and desirable was particularly painful. I couldn't turn back the clock on my age or erase the responsibilities that came with being a 42-year-old mother and professional. I couldn't offer David the carefree adoration of someone who saw him as sophisticated and worldly, rather than someone who left dirty dishes in the sink and worried about retirement savings. That afternoon, I called in sick to school again and drove to a coffee shop across town where I was unlikely to encounter anyone I knew. I needed time to process what I'd learned and decide how to respond to information that changed everything about my understanding of my marriage. The cafe was nearly empty at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday, just a few students with laptops and an elderly man reading a newspaper. I ordered a latte and found a corner table where I could spread out Tom's report and think through my options without interruption. The evidence was overwhelming. David was having an affair with a 19-year-old college student, had been financially supporting her for months using marital assets, and was actively planning to leave me for her. The relationship wasn't casual or temporary. They were shopping for apartments and making long-term plans together. I could confront David immediately, demanding explanations and ultimatums that would force him to choose between Emma and our marriage. But the evidence suggested he'd already made that choice months ago. Confronting him now would only accelerate his timeline for leaving, while giving him the opportunity to hide additional assets or spin the narrative in his favor. Alternatively, I could try to save the marriage through counseling or romantic gestures designed to compete with Emma's youth and availability. But how could I fight for a man who was capable of such elaborate deception? How could I trust someone who'd been systematically lying to me while planning his exit strategy? The third option was the one that felt most aligned with my growing sense of self-respect. I could use the time David thought he had to prepare my own exit strategy. If my husband wanted to play games with information and timing, I could play those games too. And unlike David, I wouldn't have to lie to anyone to protect my interests. I pulled out my phone and called Michael Chen, the divorce attorney Amanda had recommended. Michael had handled her case with discretion and efficiency, securing a settlement that protected her financial future while exposing her ex-husband's attempts to hide assets. Mrs. Martinez. Michael's voice was warm but professional when his secretary connected the call. Amanda Wilson gave me your contact information. She mentioned you might need legal consultation regarding your marriage. I need to understand my options, I said simply. My husband is having an affair and has been moving money around in ways that suggest he's planning to file for divorce. I want to protect myself. I understand. Can you come in for a consultation this week? I'll need to review your financial situation and discuss strategies for protecting your interests. We scheduled an appointment for Thursday afternoon, giving me 2 days to gather additional documentation and prepare for a conversation that would officially begin the end of my marriage. As I drove home from the coffee shop, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with profound sadness. Relief that I finally had a clear picture of what was happening and could stop wondering why David seemed so distant. Sadness that the man I'd loved for 25 years had become someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of betraying our family for the ego boost of dating a teenager. That evening, David came home with Chinese takeout and the kind of forced cheerfulness that I now recognized as guilt-motivated behavior. He'd probably spent the afternoon with Emma, planning their future together, and was now trying to assuage his conscience by being attentive to the wife he was preparing to abandon. I thought we could watch a movie tonight, he suggested, unpacking containers of our usual order from the restaurant where we'd been getting takeout for years. Maybe that new romantic comedy you mentioned wanting to see. The irony was devastating. David had already seen that movie with Emma, based on the ticket stub I'd found in his jacket. Now he was offering to watch it again with me, probably comparing my reactions to hers, using our evening together as research for better understanding what Emma might enjoy. That sounds nice, I said, accepting the container of Kung Pao chicken he handed me. It's been a while since we've had a quiet evening together. Too long, David agreed, his voice carrying what seemed like genuine regret. I know I've been distracted lately with work stress. I want to make more time for us. But I knew now that David's distraction had nothing to do with work and everything to do with managing 2 relationships simultaneously. His desire to spend time with me wasn't about rediscovering our connection. It was about maintaining his cover while he finalized plans to leave. We settled onto the couch to watch the movie, David's arm around my shoulders in a gesture that used to feel natural but now felt performative. As the opening credits rolled, I wondered if he was remembering Emma's reactions to the same scenes, whether he was mentally comparing our responses or simply going through the motions of being a husband while his heart was elsewhere. The romantic comedy that should have been enjoyable became a form of torture as I watched David pretend to see it for the first time. He laughed at jokes he'd already heard, acted surprised by plot twists he'd already experienced, and made comments about the characters that probably echoed conversations he'd had with Emma weeks earlier. When the movie ended, David stretched and yawned with exaggerated tiredness. I should probably get some sleep, he said, reaching for his phone to check messages. Big day tomorrow. More Peterson campaign meetings? I asked, testing whether he would maintain his usual cover story. Among other things, he replied vaguely, his attention already focused on whatever messages had accumulated during our 2-hour movie. The client wants to review some new concepts, and we're running up against the deadline. Another lie, delivered with the casual confidence that had become David's signature style. As I watched him scroll through what were probably text messages from Emma, I marveled at his ability to compartmentalize. How could he spend an evening cuddling with his wife while exchanging romantic messages with his teenage girlfriend? That night, I lay in bed, listening to David's breathing and thinking about the apartment hunting photos Tom had captured. Emma and David, planning a life together while I graded papers and worried about household budgets. The betrayal was so complete, so systematic, that I almost had to admire its thoroughness. David had been living a double life for months, supporting Emma financially while maintaining his marriage for appearances and convenience. He'd been planning his exit strategy while I'd been trying to figure out how to reconnect with him. The asymmetry was stunning. While I'd been worried about our communication problems, he'd been solving them by finding someone new to communicate with. But David had made one crucial mistake in his elaborate deception. He'd assumed I would remain passive and trusting, that I would continue accepting his explanations without investigating the truth behind them. He thought he could control the timeline and the narrative, leaving me only when it was convenient for him. What David didn't know was that I'd stopped being the passive, trusting wife he'd been taking advantage of. I had evidence of his affair, documentation of his financial deception, and a plan to protect myself from the divorce he was secretly planning. When David finally decided to reveal his plans to leave me for Emma, he was going to discover that I'd been preparing for that conversation much longer than he realized. The next morning, David left for work with his usual kiss on the cheek and promised to call later about dinner plans. I watched him drive away from our bedroom window, knowing that he was probably heading to meet Emma for coffee before his first real meeting of the day. As soon as his car disappeared around the corner, I began implementing the first phase of my own strategic plan. If David wanted to play games with truth and timing, he was about to learn that his wife could play those games too. The consultation with Michael Chen confirmed my worst fears about David's financial maneuvering while providing a roadmap for protecting my interests during what was clearly going to be a contentious divorce. Michael's office overlooked downtown Austin, the windows offering a view of the same skyline David claimed to be working under during his mysterious late meetings. "Your husband has been very methodical," Michael said, reviewing the financial documents I'd brought to our meeting. "Moving money into individual accounts, changing beneficiaries, increasing insurance coverage. These are all classic strategies for someone preparing to file for divorce, while minimizing their spouse's claim to marital assets. How long do you think he's been planning this?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Based on the timeline of these financial changes, I'd estimate at least 6 months, possibly longer. The account openings and asset transfers show a pattern of deliberate preparation rather than spontaneous decision-making. Michael spread the bank statements across his conference table, using a yellow highlighter to mark the transactions that demonstrated David's systematic approach to financial deception. The highlighted sections painted a picture of someone who'd been carefully positioning himself for a divorce while his wife remained completely unaware of his plans. "The good news," Michael continued, "is that Texas is a community property state, which means you're entitled to half of all marital assets regardless of whose name they're in. The bad news is that your husband's advance planning could complicate the process of identifying and recovering those assets. What about the money he's been giving to his girlfriend?" Michael's expression hardened. Using marital assets to support an extramarital relationship is considered dissipation of community property. We can seek reimbursement for those funds as part of the divorce settlement, but we'll need to document the full extent of his financial support for this woman. "I have bank records showing regular transfers to her account," I said, producing Tom's financial analysis, "and evidence that he's been paying for her living expenses, education costs, even luxury purchases." "This is excellent documentation," Michael said, reviewing Tom's report. "If we can prove that your husband used community funds to support his affair, the court can award you additional compensation to offset those losses." The legal framework for protecting my interests was clearer than I'd expected, but Michael warned that David's advance planning suggested he might be preparing to file first, potentially catching me off guard with aggressive demands or attempts to control the narrative. "The spouse who files first often has strategic advantages," Michael explained. "They control the timing, can present their version of events first, and may have already moved assets beyond easy recovery. Given what you've told me about your husband's behavior, I suspect he's planning to file soon." "How soon?" "It's hard to say, but typically someone who's been this methodical about financial preparation files within a few months of completing their asset protection strategy." "Has he mentioned anything about his timeline for leaving?" I thought about the apartment hunting photos, Emma's social media posts about moving to a bigger place, and David's recent comments about the Peterson campaign wrapping up soon. All the evidence suggested he was preparing for major life changes in the near future. "I think he's planning to tell me after his current work project ends," I said. "He's been using the project as an excuse for all his strange behavior, so logically he'd wait until that excuse is no longer available. That gives us perhaps a month to prepare our own strategy," Michael said. "I recommend we file a protective petition immediately to prevent him from hiding additional assets, and we should consider hiring a forensic accountant to identify any money trails we haven't discovered yet." The idea of hiring additional professionals felt overwhelming, but Michael assured me that protecting my financial future was worth the upfront investment. After 25 years of marriage, I was entitled to significant assets, but only if we could identify and claim them before David found ways to hide them beyond recovery. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," Michael said as our consultation wound down, "the emotional aspect of this situation. Your husband's affair with someone so young, combined with his systematic deception, suggests this divorce could become very contentious. Are you prepared for the possibility that he might try to rewrite the history of your marriage to justify his behavior?" "What do you mean?" "Often, when someone has been having an affair, they convince themselves that their marriage was already over, that their spouse was somehow responsible for their infidelity. Your husband might claim you were cold or distant, that you'd grown apart naturally, that the affair was just the final step in a relationship that was already dead. The possibility that David might blame me for his choice to cheat with a teenager was so outrageous that I almost laughed. But as I thought about his recent behavior, the forced cheerfulness, the guilt-motivated romantic gestures, the way he seemed to be going through the motions of being a husband, I realized he might already be constructing a narrative that cast me as the villain in our marriage's demise. I want to be prepared for whatever he throws at me," I said firmly. "I've spent months trying to understand why my husband was pulling away from me. Now I know it's because he was pulling towards someone else. I'm not going to let him rewrite 25 years of marriage to justify cheating with a college student." That evening, I implemented the first phase of my own information-gathering strategy. While David was at another mysterious work meeting, I went through our shared computer more systematically, using data recovery software to access deleted files and browsing history that had been cleared. What I found painted an even more comprehensive picture of David's double life. Email exchanges with real estate agents about rental properties near the university. Research into Austin Community College's academic calendar, suggesting he was planning his life around Emma's school schedule. Even searches for engagement rings from high-end jewelry stores, indicating that David was considering marriage to Emma despite still being married to me. The engagement ring searches were particularly devastating. David was apparently planning to propose to a 19-year-old college student while still living with his wife of 25 years. The audacity was breathtaking, but it also revealed how completely David had emotionally disconnected from our marriage. In his mind, I'd already been replaced. Emma wasn't just an affair. She was his future wife, someone he was planning to build a new life with while discarding the old one like an outdated business strategy. The searches showed him looking at rings that cost more than many people's annual salaries, investments in a relationship that was barely old enough to have survived a semester change. I printed screenshots of David's searches and added them to the growing file I was building for Michael. Each piece of evidence strengthened my case while revealing new dimensions of my husband's betrayal. This wasn't a midlife crisis or a temporary lapse in judgment. It was a complete life renovation that happened to include discarding his current family. The most painful discovery was a draft email I found in David's deleted folder, apparently intended for Emma but never sent. The message detailed his plans for, quote, transitioning out of his current living situation and timeline for, quote, making their relationship official. He wrote about me with the distant tone of someone discussing a business obligation rather than a wife he'd loved for decades. "Sarah will probably want to stay in the house initially," the draft read, "but we can work out the financial details so that everyone gets what they need. She's reasonable about practical matters, and I don't think she'll make the process more difficult than necessary." The casual assumption that I would be reasonable about my husband leaving me for a teenager was stunning. David had apparently convinced himself that I would cooperate with his plans to dismantle our life together, that I would quietly accept whatever settlement he offered, rather than fighting for what I was legally entitled to receive. This draft email revealed more about David's mindset than anything else I'd discovered. He genuinely believed he could control the narrative and timeline of our divorce, managing the situation like a business merger rather than the destruction of a family. He thought his careful financial planning and gradual emotional withdrawal had prepared the ground for a smooth transition that wouldn't significantly disrupt his life. What David hadn't considered was the possibility that his reasonable, practical wife might be gathering her own evidence and making her own plans. He'd been so focused on protecting himself from potential consequences that he'd forgotten to consider whether I might be taking steps to protect myself from him. Over the weekend, I drove to Emma's neighborhood under the pretense of visiting a bookstore near the university. I wanted to see where David was spending his time. to understand the environment that had become more appealing to him than our family home. The apartment complex where Emma lived was typical for college students. Basic construction, minimal landscaping, parking lots filled with older cars decorated with university stickers. It was the kind of place David and I had lived 30 years ago when we were first married and couldn't afford anything better. Was the appeal of this environment purely about Emma, or was David nostalgic for a time in his life when everything felt possible and uncomplicated? Living with Emma meant returning to the simplicity of early adulthood, before mortgages and retirement planning, and the complex responsibilities that came with middle-aged success. I sat in my car across from Emma's building, wondering if David was inside at that moment, helping her study for finals, or planning their next romantic getaway. The ordinariness of the setting made the situation feel surreal. My husband was risking our family's stability for the chance to play house with someone who probably still had student debt and a fake ID. But as I watched young couples walking hand in hand around the complex, laughing and talking with the animated gestures of people who hadn't yet learned to guard their emotions, I began to understand the appeal. Emma represented possibility rather than obligation, excitement rather than routine, admiration rather than the complicated mixture of love and irritation that characterized long marriages. David wasn't just cheating on me, he was trying to cheat time itself, attempting to recapture feelings and experiences that belonged to a different stage of life. Emma was his fountain of youth, someone whose presence made him feel like the sophisticated older man, rather than the middle-aged husband, who forgot to take out the trash and worried about his cholesterol levels. The realization that I was competing with David's fantasies about his own youth rather than just another woman was both liberating and heartbreaking. I couldn't win that competition because I couldn't make David 25 again, couldn't erase the responsibilities and realities that came with our actual life together. But I also understood that David's pursuit of recaptured youth was ultimately doomed. Emma would grow up, develop her own ambitions and interests, eventually realized that a man old enough to be her father wasn't the exciting adventure she'd imagined. The relationship that seemed so perfect now was built on temporary circumstances that wouldn't survive the natural progression of time. David was destroying our stable, mature partnership for the chance to experience the intense but ultimately shallow excitement of dating someone who saw him as exotic and sophisticated rather than familiar and predictable. He was trading 25 years of shared history for the ego boost of being desired by someone young enough to think his stories about the 1990s were fascinating historical accounts. As I drove home from my reconnaissance mission, I felt a strange sense of clarity about the situation. David's affair wasn't really about me or our marriage. It was about his own fears of aging and irrelevance. I couldn't fix those fears for him, and I wasn't going to destroy my own self-respect trying to compete with a teenager for my husband's attention. If David wanted to trade our life together for a fantasy of eternal youth, that was his choice to make. But I wasn't going to make it easy for him, and I wasn't going to accept his assumption that I would quietly cooperate with his plans to discard me. The passive, trusting wife who had spent months wondering why her husband seemed distant was gone. In her place was someone who understood exactly what was happening and was prepared to fight for what she deserved. David had been planning this divorce for months while lying to my face. Now it was time for him to discover that his reasonable, practical wife had been making plans of her own. Tom's final report arrived the following Monday, and the contents exceeded even my worst expectations about the scope of David's deception. The private investigator had been thorough beyond my original instructions, uncovering evidence that transformed my understanding of the timeline and seriousness of David's relationship with Emma. The affair had been going on for nearly a year, not the few months I'd estimated based on changes in David's behavior. Tom had traced financial transactions back to the previous summer, showing regular payments to Emma that coincided with David's membership at Pinnacle Fitness. What I'd interpreted as a recent midlife crisis was actually a well-established relationship that had been hidden from me with sophisticated planning and consistent lies. The financial support David had been providing Emma was staggering in its scope. Beyond the regular deposits Tom had previously identified, David had also paid for Emma's dental work, bought her a laptop for school, covered her car repairs, and even provided what appeared to be spending money for spring break. Over the past 12 months, David had transferred nearly $40,000 in marital assets to support his girlfriend's lifestyle and education. Most devastating was evidence that David and Emma had already been living together part-time for months. Tom had documented David's car parked overnight at Emma's apartment complex at least twice a week since January, suggesting he'd been maintaining dual residences while telling me he was working late or traveling for business. The hotel charges on David's hidden credit cards weren't just for romantic getaways. They were for nights when David apparently needed an alibi for staying away from home. He'd been paying for hotel rooms he never used, creating fake receipts for business trips that provided cover for the nights he spent at Emma's apartment. The level of systematic deception was breathtaking. David hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been living an entirely parallel life, complete with shared domestic routines, financial responsibilities, and long-term planning that treated me as an obstacle to be managed rather than a wife to be considered. Tom's surveillance had captured video footage of David and Emma at a furniture store, selecting items for what appeared to be a shared living space. The timestamp showed this had occurred 3 weeks earlier, during a Saturday when David had told me he was attending a mandatory agency retreat. Instead, he'd been shopping for bedroom furniture with his teenage girlfriend, planning their cohabitation while maintaining the fiction of our marriage. The investigator had also obtained Emma's class schedule and cross-referenced it with David's supposed work obligations. The correlation was undeniable. David's late nights and weekend commitments consistently aligned with times when Emma was free from school responsibilities. He'd been structuring his lies around her academic calendar, prioritizing her availability over any commitments to our family. Most disturbing was evidence that David had introduced Emma to his colleagues at the agency. Tom had photographed them together at a company happy hour, Emma laughing with people I'd known for years, while David stood beside her with obvious pride. Our mutual friends had been meeting his girlfriend while I remained unaware of her existence. The betrayal extended beyond just our marriage to include our entire social circle. David had been parading Emma around professional events, while telling me the gatherings were too boring or work-focused for spouses to attend. I'd been excluded from social functions where my husband was openly displaying his affair to people who knew both of us. The realization that David's colleagues had been complicit in his deception, or at least aware of it, added another layer of humiliation to an already devastating situation. How many people had known about Emma while I continued playing the role of the devoted wife, asking about David's work friends and expressing interest in agency events I was apparently no longer welcome to attend? Tom had also uncovered evidence of David's long-term financial planning that went far beyond simple asset protection. David had been consulting with accountants and financial advisors about tax implications of divorce, optimal timing for asset transfers, and strategies for minimizing alimony obligations. He'd been treating our marriage like a business entity to be dissolved, rather than a relationship to be ended. The most chilling discovery was a detailed timeline David had apparently created for managing his transition from our marriage to his relationship with Emma. Tom had obtained photographs of handwritten notes that outlined specific dates for major steps: when to stop sleeping in our shared bedroom, when to file for divorce, when to introduce Emma to Jake and Lily as his new girlfriend. David had scheduled our family's destruction like a project timeline, complete with milestones and contingency planning. The notes showed he'd been considering different scenarios for telling me about the affair, calculating which approach would minimize conflict and expedite the divorce process. One notation was particularly devastating: summer timing optimal, kids adjusted to college, minimal disruption to family schedule. David had been planning to destroy our marriage during the summer break, apparently believing that timing the announcement for when our children were home from college would somehow make the betrayal less traumatic for everyone involved. The casual cruelty of scheduling our family's disintegration around his convenience was stunning. David had been approaching the end of our marriage with the same methodical planning he brought to client campaigns, treating the emotional devastation of his wife and children as variables to be managed, rather than consequences to be avoided. Tom's report included psychological analysis that helped explain David's ability to maintain such an elaborate deception without apparent guilt or internal conflict. According to the investigator's expert consultant, People engaged in long-term affairs often develop sophisticated compartmentalization skills that allow them to justify their behavior while avoiding cognitive dissonance. Mr. Martinez appears to have convinced himself that his marriage was already over, the analysis noted. His behavior suggests someone who views his affair as the solution to relationship problems, rather than the cause of them. This psychological framework allows him to maintain his deception while believing he's acting in everyone's best interests. The idea that David had rewritten our marriage's history to justify his affair was exactly what Michael Chen had warned me about. In David's mind, I'd probably become a burden to be escaped, rather than a wife to be cherished. Emma represented freedom and possibility, while I represented obligation and routine. But David's psychological justifications didn't change the legal and financial realities of what he'd done. Using marital assets to support an affair was still dissipation of community property. Systematically hiding financial information was still fraud. Planning to abandon his family obligations was still a breach of his marriage vows and legal commitments. The evidence Tom had gathered was more than sufficient to protect my interests in divorce proceedings, but it also revealed the full extent of David's transformation from the man I'd married into someone I no longer recognized. The husband who had once consulted me about every major decision was now making life-altering choices without my knowledge or consent. That evening, I sat in our kitchen, reviewing Tom's complete file, while David attended another fictitious work meeting. The evidence filled 3 thick folders and painted a picture of systematic betrayal that exceeded anything I could have imagined when I'd first noticed his distracted behavior. I thought about the David I'd married 25 years earlier, a young man who'd been honest about his feelings, considerate of others' needs, and incapable of the elaborate deceptions that now characterized his daily life. When had that person disappeared? When had my husband become someone who could lie to my face while planning to abandon our family for a teenager? The transformation wasn't sudden. Tom's evidence showed it had been gradual, building over months of small compromises and incremental deceptions. Each lie had made the next one easier. Each secret had created space for larger secrets, until David was living an entirely fabricated existence that bore no resemblance to the truth of his activities. But David had made one crucial miscalculation in his elaborate planning. He'd assumed I would remain passive and ignorant, that I would continue accepting his explanations without investigation or suspicion. He'd been so focused on protecting himself from consequences that he'd forgotten to consider whether I might be protecting myself from him. The man who thought he was controlling every aspect of our marriage's dissolution was about to discover that his wife had been conducting her own investigation and making her own plans. David's carefully constructed timeline was about to be disrupted by someone who'd learned to play the same games he'd been playing, but with better evidence and legal representation. As I locked Tom's files in the safety deposit box I'd opened at a bank across town, I felt a grim satisfaction about the strength of my position. David might have been planning this divorce for a year, but I'd been preparing for it with the knowledge that he was lying to me about everything. When David finally decided to reveal his affair and demand a divorce, he was going to discover that his reasonable, practical wife had become someone much more formidable. The woman who'd spent months wondering why her husband seemed distant had been replaced by someone who knew exactly what he'd been doing and was prepared to make him pay for every lie he'd told. The meeting with the forensic accountant Michael had recommended revealed the full scope of David's financial deception and provided a roadmap for recovering assets he'd attempted to hide. Patricia Wong had built her career uncovering hidden wealth in high-asset divorce cases, and she approached David's financial maneuvering with the systematic precision of someone who'd seen every trick in the book. "Your husband has been sophisticated in his approach," Patricia said, spreading financial documents across her conference table like a detective examining evidence. "But he's also been somewhat predictable. The pattern of asset movement suggests someone following advice from online forums rather than professional consultation." "What does that mean for my case?" "It means he's made recoverable mistakes. Moving money between accounts leaves digital footprints, and the timing of his transfers creates a clear pattern of deliberate concealment that the court won't tolerate." Patricia had identified assets David had hidden beyond what I'd discovered through my own investigation. Business investments made through shell companies, retirement accounts opened without my knowledge, even a cryptocurrency portfolio that he'd funded with transfers from our joint savings. The cryptocurrency is particularly interesting, Patricia noted, highlighting a series of transactions on her computer screen. Your husband has been moving money into digital assets over the past 6 months, probably believing they'd be harder to trace in divorce proceedings. Can we recover those funds? Absolutely. Digital currencies might seem anonymous, but they leave permanent transaction records. We can trace every dollar he's moved and demand its return as community property. The total amount of hidden assets Patricia had uncovered exceeded $200,000. Money David had systematically moved from our marital accounts into investments and accounts designed to shield them from divorce proceedings. The forensic accountant's analysis showed this wasn't spontaneous financial planning, but a calculated strategy to reduce his obligations to me while maximizing his resources for starting a new life with Emma. Patricia's investigation had also revealed that David had been inflating his business expenses and underreporting his income, classic strategies for reducing apparent wealth before divorce proceedings. The Peterson campaign that had supposedly been consuming all his time and energy was actually less demanding than David had claimed. He'd been exaggerating his work obligations to justify his absences while creating a false impression of financial pressure. Armed with Patricia's findings and Tom's surveillance evidence, Michael developed a comprehensive legal strategy that would not only protect my interests, but also hold David accountable for his systematic deception. The plan involved filing for divorce first, catching David off guard before he could implement his own timeline, while simultaneously seeking emergency orders to freeze his access to marital assets. We're going to control the narrative and the timing, Michael explained during our final strategy session. Your husband thinks he's been clever, but his own documentation is going to be the evidence that destroys his case. The legal framework was in place, the evidence was overwhelming, and my financial future was protected. All that remained was waiting for the right moment to execute the plan that would expose David's deception and ensure he faced consequences for his choices. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.